But I wanted to write, he's from Louisiana, and I said, I want
Mhm.
to write some French poetry to set. And at first I was looking at some Haitian poets, but if you've ever seen Haitian dialect, some of the diacritical marks don't belong to any other language.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, almost every poem, I looked through a couple of different collections, and almost every poem begins talking about how beautiful the people are, how beautiful and warm the island is, and how there are flowers and trees, and streams and valleys, and then they all end up in murder and death. And I just said, this isn't quite what I'm looking for. And so I was in Barnes and Nobles, and I asked one of the attendants, I'm like, do you have any other francophone poetry? And he said, actually there's a new collection coming out by I forget his first name, Shapiro. And if you wait on that, it's going to be out in about 4 or 5 months. I said, I'll wait. And so when it came out, it turns out he had done new translations of this book of poems, Lesson. And I just said, this is perfect. These are actually American poets who are writing in formal French. And as I really got into the genre de couleur and realized they were actually going to France to study. And
Mm-hmm.
back to Louisiana and helping build this middle caste, if you will. I just thought that was really fascinating. And some of the subject matter really took off after the same structure as some of the great French poets. But they were doing it with an American twist.
Right.
They were writing their own experiences in. I thought that was really fascinating. And because it was formal French, I had an easier time understanding it. So I said, these are perfect. I'm just going to go for it. But I got going. I mean, some of
Yeah.
them are really, really long because some of them are fables and they are
Mm-hmm.
like, good Lord, this is an opera. I can't do this one. But some of them are really like couplets, really short. And I just said, this is just spicy and kind of wicked and, kind of snarky in that French kind of way that's like,
Mm-hmm.
sound pretty, but I'm just going to cut you.
So it's been performed, and what was the process of getting it up, and what kind of reception did you have with it?
It's been interesting for people who don't understand French. They go, these are really pretty songs, but for people who understand French and really get into the poetry, they're like, whoa, I had no idea. And that's the great thing about them is this, we don't really know enough of our history.
Right.
We boil American history down to like big chunks, big events.
Right.
But it's those little events that are the connective tissue that make the rest of it make sense.
Yeah.
Those stories, because those are the real humanist stories
Mm-hmm.
that we actually can connect to on a much more personal level. I mean, there are big events, and we, as people in the society, we can connect to the big events communally,
Yeah.
but really go for a personal thing. Like there's a setting of Clair de Lune, but it's not like the typical Clair de Lune that you would run into. It's on the verge of creepy.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a really fascinating poem. And then I had to go back and do a little research because this was still the time of arranged marriages.
Mm-hmm.
So this would not have been out of step with their society in that time. And if you ever study ethics, our ethics today are a lot different than they were in the 50s,
Right.
than they were in 1900, than they were in 1855. And
Right.
so group of people that go, that's horrible. It's just kind of imperialistic and really limiting in your worldview because, when you study ethics, you learn that other people's values have merit and you have to learn to at least be aware or accepting of what they value. Writing songs are very personal and they are very emotional. And if you're not in touch with that side of your psyche, you can write yourself into a corner real fast. I just have to love singing, so that makes it a lot easier for me.
Yeah. So truth has to be at the bottom of it, which is
Always.
That's awesome. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the cycle? No, we're only doing couplet, vers écrit, and mon vieux chapeau. So we're not doing the whole cycle because there's only so much one can do in an evening.
As I was looking at the poems, I kept coming back to this idea of I want to see another side of what we call this American life. This is from a subset of citizens that we just don't hear very much about. So one of the poems is basically set on a ship, and that ship is bringing this young Jean de Couleur back to Louisiana after his studies. So what is that about? And there's a storm in the middle of the poem. I'm like, oh, this is too delicious. There's another where I decided to write a polonaise because I'm like, why not? And it's all about this bravado and this regalness that people who are of privilege, and we don't normally think of people of color being privileged, but in that society at that time, there was a privilege there that was not extended to African Americans who were enslaved, but there's a certain amount of privilege that did not extend to the white children of the planters. There was a clear separation. And that was really fascinating. Just like, how do you separate these things out in your own head?
That's a lot of work.
That's a whole,
White supremacy is tiring.
And we're still paying the price for that.
Yeah.
Because that stuff spills out. And so we're still wrestling with a lot of these questions. There are places where, you know, a love poem. There's one called Aida, to Ida. And it's just this rapturous, overflowing gush of words, I can't say enough about you. And
That's
then
great.
You know, just great poem. There's another one, it's all about, I'm writing this little epigram to the most beautiful brown eyes I've ever seen.
Is that the vers écrits?
Yeah.
Yeah, that one was lovely to do.
That's a fun
Dynamic. The dynamic place that makes it just speak, you know?
Yeah. And see, each one of these, I chose purposely to write them all in a slightly different style.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a typical song cycle.
Right.
I was looking at some of the great French composers like Ravel, like Debussy, and I'm looking at some of the things they were doing. I'm not trying to exactly emulate them, but that was a leaping point. So every piece is in a slightly different style.
Yeah.
And these poems are also generational because the last piece is called Mon Vieux Chapeau, my old hat. And it's just an older person with this hat that's going out of style, but they hope that they can pass that hat on to somebody who's going to appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I just think that speaks to all of us on a very human level, you know? So great stuff like that. I had a lot of fun writing it.